Since the early 1900s, scientists have worked on the development of a machine or treatment that could successfully stand in for diseased or damaged kidneys. The evolution of the artificial kidney, the first true vital artificial organ, is a story of the kinds of challenges that only the human body can present and the kinds of creative solutions only the human mind could devise. In 1854, in a paper titled On Osmotic Force, Thomas Graham, a Scottish chemist, described the passage of solutes through a membrane fashioned from an ox bladder. For the first time, this filtering activity was given a name, dialysis. It was not until the early 1900s, however, that John Jacob Abel, a pharmacologist at Johns Hopkins University, postulated that patients with renal failure might be treated by circulating their blood outside their body and selectively filtering or cleansing it.
Now it occurred to me that as long as the kidneys can no longer eliminate all of these substances from the body, which, when retained, cause this toxic state, I say it occurred to me that if in some way we could remove these toxic substances from the blood of these patients, they might be improved, at least for the time being.
In 1913, Abel and his associates developed and used a vivid diffusion unit housing numerous tubes made of a porous plastic-like film called colloidin. Dialysis solution passed around the tubes, which were filled with blood and carried off the toxins that passed through the colloidin membrane. Heparin was unknown in 1913, so hyaluron, extracted by crushing the heads of leeches, was used as an anticoagulant. Abel's experiments, although not performed on humans, are the basis for many of the investigations that followed. Heinrich Nicholas was also working in the early 1900s at the University of Hamburg Medical School. He was responsible for several important features incorporated into contemporary dialyzers.
I was a medical student, was drafted into the German army, and was transferred from the infantry to a field hospital on the Western Front. That was in 1916. And I saw horrible things going on there. I saw many cases there of young soldiers in uremic coma, and that impressed me terribly. I thought, how could I prolong the life of these lovable youngsters? And that's how the thought of an artificial kidney grew within me.
Nicholas used sheep's peritoneum as his filtering membrane. He found, however, that when blood was pumped through this material, the membrane expanded too rapidly. To limit the expansion, he devised a sandwich, placing sheets of chicken wire screening on either side of the membrane and squeezing them together with paper clips. In 1924, George Haas of Germany performed the first human dialysis. Using multiple dialyzers to increase the surface area of the membrane, Haas exposed more blood to the dialyzing solution, creating a more efficient cleansing system. However, because arterial pressure was not great enough to propel the blood through the apparatus, he found it necessary to develop an electric pump to move the blood through the tubes. On February 18, 1926, using heparin that he made himself, Haas dialyzed a 20-year-old woman in the terminal stages of uremia. This 35-minute procedure was the first continuous dialysis. In 1937, William Tollimer, a student and close friend of John Jacob Abel, made a discovery of considerable value. He found that cellulose acetate, which was used as a casing in the sausage industry, could be used effectively as a semi-permeable membrane to remove solutes from the blood. One of the first to use the cellophane membrane was Willem Kolff, a Dutch physician working in the Netherlands. Between 1938 and 1944, as the war raged round him, Kolff designed and built a number of artificial kidney machines using a horizontal rotating drum device. The drum, constructed of wood slats, was wrapped with 30 to 40 meters of cellulose acetate sausage skin tubing. As the patient's blood entered the tubing, it was moved along by the rotating movement of the drum. The lower portion of the drum was suspended in a trough containing dialyzing solution. As the drum rotated, the blood was swept through the bath for cleansing. Complete dialysis took about 6 hours. The primary problem with the device was created by its rotating mechanism, which caused the tubes connecting patient and machine to become twisted. The solution? A split coupling adapted from an automobile water pump. By this means, Kolff was able to keep the tube stationary while the drum rotated. The Kolff kidney was effective and inexpensive. Only the sausage skin membrane had to be replaced, and all connectors and rubber tubing were reused. But operating the machine was difficult and tedious. Beginning in the early 1940s, Kolff tried dialysis on patients who had suffered acute kidney failure. It was his hope that with a few treatments to clear the toxins from their bodies, they might be sustained until they could regain use of their kidneys. Kolff's 17th patient was a 68-year-old housewife purported to be a Nazi collaborator. Kolff violently opposed her views, but he knew that he could not allow politics to interfere with his medical decisions. On September 11, 1945, he connected the woman to his artificial kidney. Over 80 liters of blood flowed through the machine for 11 and a half hours. Her urea went down, and she became the first person to be maintained on dialysis until kidney function returned. During the last year of the war, conditions became more difficult for Kolff. Kampen, Holland, where he was working, was at the center of the Nazi occupation, and the Germans watched his activities closely. However, with the cooperation of the Dutch underground, Kolff succeeded in building a few machines for other hospitals. He smuggled one to The Hague, part by part, another to Amsterdam. Kolff writes, quote, "In the early days, the successes were few, but even with these poor results, the potential for clinical improvement with hemodialysis was clearly evident to us, albeit frustratingly out of reach. When a patient who had been comatose for days woke up, it was all the encouragement we needed to keep going." As World War II came to an end, the pace of research began to quicken. Nils Alwall in Sweden developed a vertical drum kidney that did not have to be rotated. The membrane-wrapped drum remained stationary and the dialysis fluid moved around it. To improve ultrafiltration, he used a suction pump on the dialysate outlet, thereby creating the first negative pressure dialyzer. Also in the 40s, Gordon Murray at Toronto General Hospital performed what is thought to be the first dialysis in North America. In the late 1940s, Kolff brought his artificial kidney to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. There he trained Drs. Alfred Fishman and Irving Krupp in its use. The first clinical use of the artificial kidney in the United States occurred at Mount Sinai, January 26, 1948. Such therapy was considered radical, however, and therefore was restricted to after-hours use in the surgical suite. In the evenings, the gallery would fill with observers in tuxedos and evening gowns who had returned to the hospital after dinner or theater to watch the novel procedure. In time, Kolff realized that for dialysis to gain acceptance, the rotating drum would have to be modified for easier use. While visiting the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston, Kolff was asked by Carl Walter, president of Fenwal Laboratories, and Edward Olson, an engineer, to design and help build a new version of the rotating drum kidney. Olson's new design solved many problems and contributed to the wide acceptance of this early machine. Components that handled blood were made of plastic that could be steam sterilized. Handles were added to help wind the cellophane on the drum. Plastic valves minimized clotting. A motor drive was added to raise and lower the pan. A lucite hood prevented heat loss. There was a heater for the dialyzing fluid, a membrane sterilizer, and a positive pressure pump. It was this Kolff Brigham unit that provided the training for most nephrologists in the early 50s. And it was Brigham Hospital that became a center for training physicians in the use of the rotating drum dialyzer. Members of the Brigham team, such as John Merrill and David Hume, became involved in all aspects of renal care, including kidney transplants. A group headed by Paul Tashan at Walter Reed Hospital was trained to use the Kolff-Brigham kidney and then sent to Korea to treat the soldiers incurring acute renal failure. A U.S. Army study had shown that prior to battle, soldiers often were served a hearty meal. Then if they were wounded, they were transfused with whole blood. The net effect was a potassium increase that could cause cardiac arrest. The condition had been seen during World War II, but there had been no way then to document or combat it. During the Korean War, for the first time, helicopters were available to evacuate the wounded to MASH units for prompt treatment. And for the first time, the Kolff-Brigham kidney was ready to cleanse the blood of the wounded, to lower the excessive potassium levels, to save lives. During the same period, at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Leonard Skeggs and Jack Leonards designed a parallel plate dialyzer to reduce the priming volume needed and with low enough resistance to eliminate the need for a blood pump. They sandwiched two sheets of membrane between grooved rubber plates. Blood flowed along one side of the membrane, dialyzing fluid along the other. Metal plates compressed the membrane, preventing expansion. In the 50s, Frederick Kiel of Norway developed a more compact version of the Skeggs and Leonards parallel plate dialyzer, using 4 to 6 layers in place of 20 or more. Kiel was the first to use a new cellulose membrane trademarked Cuprofane. The coil dialyzer had its beginnings in the late 40s when Bodo von Gerelz in Sweden wrapped membrane tubing concentrically around a core, thereby introducing the more compact design used in modern coil dialyzers and giving them the name coil. One of the most useful kidneys of its time was the pressure cooker kidney developed by William Inouye and Joseph Engelberg in the late 50s. The pressure cooker, which held a stationary coil dialyzer, collected the ultrafiltrate, allowing the rate of fluid removal to be monitored. Kolff, who came to the Cleveland Clinic in 1950, closely followed the work of Alwall, von Gerelz, and Inouye and Engelberg. His goal became the development of a composite model of their dialyzer systems. The first Kolff dialyzer, produced in collaboration with Bruno Watzinger of Vienna, gained the name twin coil because it had 2 blood paths supported by woven fiberglass screening. Kolff referred to the twin coil as his orange juice kidney because the core around which the membrane was wrapped was an orange juice can. With his dialyzer mounted in a modified washing machine, Kolff set forth to convince industry this kidney was worth developing on a commercial scale. After a long search, he turned to William Graham, later chairman and chief executive officer of Baxter Travenol Laboratories. Graham, a lawyer with a master's degree in chemistry, recognized the potential of Kolff's ideas. A long-term relationship between Kolff and Travenol began, heralding an era of progress in the development of dialysis equipment.
The early days were discouraging. It was a difficult time for us because in those early days, the program was alternately stimulating and frustrating. It was exciting, but challenging and demanding. We weren't entirely sure of just what our problems were. We did know that at that time, there was no established market for dialysis equipment. We felt, nevertheless, that there was an important medical need. And where there is a medical need, we have always felt that the market would come eventually.
Model U200A, a system based on Kolff's orange juice kidney, became the first commercially available, completely disposable dialyzer. The delivery system used a Sigma Motor brand pump, similar to those used to pump oil in the petroleum industry. Small rods moved in order, milking the line and pushing the blood along. The first complete hardware system based on the washing machine principle and incorporating the pump became available for sale October 30th, 1956. No longer would the scarcity of dialysis equipment serve as the major deterrent to widening the availability of patient care.
The medical community was wary of this device in the early stages. Many of the hospitals where it would be used felt that they needed to have an expert team of doctors, technicians, even engineers on hand before they undertook the dialysis process. They also, in many cases, felt that they needed to have these people available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to cover the acute cases that might come in on an emergency basis. Under the circumstances, they were slow to set up this laborious operation, at least as they visualized it. This slowness in acceptance of the product naturally discouraged us, and yet at the same time we still felt that the potential was tremendous. So we kept at it. We have felt that this procedure was accepted, in part at least, because of the educational and informational work that was done by academia, led by Dr. Kolff and ourselves, and have believed that this was an excellent example of the cooperative actions that can be taken by these two groups in developing responses to new medical needs.
Doctors traveled to the Cleveland Clinic to train under Dr. Kolff. The University of Colorado became another leading training center. And at Georgetown University, a complete protocol for dialyzable drugs and poisons was developed. As the training impasse was gradually eliminated, it became evident that gaining better long-range access to the patient's blood vessels was the next problem to be solved. Treatment was still primarily for those patients with temporary renal shutdown. For each time a patient was to be dialyzed, he actually had to undergo a kind of surgery to insert catheter tubes into an artery and vein, and acceptable sites were rapidly used up. For chronic dialysis to become a practical reality, continuous access to the bloodstream was needed. Alwal and Tashan had attempted to perfect devices that allowed continuous access, but they were not completely successful. Clotting remained a major problem. In the late 50s, Belding Scribner and Wayne Quinton at the University of Washington were evaluating various materials for use in an access device. An electrician mentioned to them that Teflon brand tubing might be a good candidate. Scribner and Quinton recall the episode.
And he said, have you ever heard of Teflon? I said, no, I've never heard of Teflon. He said, well, go down to Central Service and you'll see some rolls of it down there. And sure enough, here were these rolls of stuff that were stamped with electrical contractor on the outside. They weren't even for medical use. So I took this to Wayne, and he said, boy, this looks like terrible stuff to me, but I'll try and figure out how to use it. And we chose it for the wrong reason. We chose it because the surgeon said that it didn't react with the tissues. And it was only much later that we found out that it was the non-stick property of the Teflon that really made the shunt work in the first place.
Working with Teflon was extremely difficult, but Scribner and Quinton finally were able to form it into the necessary shape for an arterial-to-venous shunt. The shunt provided continuous circulation of the blood when the patient was not attached to the machine. It finally made continuing dialysis of chronic patients a real possibility. On March 9th, 1960, Scribner implanted the shunt in Clyde Shields, a machinist. Shields became the first patient to spend his life on an artificial kidney, a fact that was made possible by the shunt.
The minute the thing had gone a month, I knew that we were into something that was different than we'd ever been able to do before, because we could dialyze at will. I mean, that was the thing that was new. And beyond that, I had no, first place, I didn't know, based on Schreiner's experience, which was valid, whether you could sustain life with a dialyzer, even no matter how much you dialyze. So that was the first question. And then, of course, Clyde got malignant hypertension right away, and we had to figure out how to do that, and that was where we learned about the importance of sodium. We had no drugs. And so we literally saved his life the very first couple of months by desalting him and curing his malignant hypertension. And then they started walking like ducks, and that was neuropathy. And we upped the ante again, and then they got arthritis, and we figured out that was uric acid, and on and on.
Well, there was always another hurdle to take on. As you began to expand the time that the patients were kept alive, you found new and additional problems.
Scribner's shunt enabled him to establish at the University of Washington Hospital the first dialysis unit for chronic patients in the United States. Scribner's associate, Albert Babb, developed an automated proportioning system for mixing the dialysis solution to replace the labor-intensive batch system then being used. He made it part of a central delivery system for multiple patient use in the center. Known by the patients as the monster, the dialysis equipment was large, cumbersome, and not very attractive, but it was effective. In 1962, over 10,000 new patients developed uremic poisoning, and still only 1 in 50 could get access to a machine, not because they were not being made, but because the costs of treatment made general availability difficult. Hospital units and dialysis centers were few, and individual costs were too high to assume in great numbers, about $25,000 per year per patient. In Seattle, 7 citizens were appointed to a selection committee to decide through individual conscience who could use the few machines. In effect, who should live and who should die. Thus, in the early 60s, to accommodate more patients and lower the costs of dialysis care, Scribner and others, such as Merrill in Boston and Sheldon in England, began to teach patients and their families to dialyze at home. Ben Kibble, a PhD trained by the Brigham Group, became one of the first patients to dialyze at home using the twin coil. Scribner had Babb construct a miniature home version of his monster dialyzer and trained a teenage girl, Carolyn Helms, and her family to maintain her on a machine at home in 1964. It took effort, it took time, and there were crises. But for Carolyn, who had been rejected for clinical dialysis by the selection committee, the kidney meant life itself. Home patient programs began to proliferate in Boston, Denver, and Seattle. Dialysis took another step forward in 1966 when James Semino and his associates developed an alternative access system known as the internal arteriovenous fistula. They created a small opening between an adjoining forearm artery and vein and surgically fused the two. The resulting blood flow distended the vein, providing an easy target for large fistula needles. The fistula became the preferred access system for dialysis patients. In the 1960s, one-of-a-kind dialyzers gave way to commercially available systems. Standardization of equipment and solutions heightened both safety and efficiency. Hollow fiber technology, originated by I.H. Mann in 1956, lent itself well to the development of capillary flow dialyzers, a system close in design to Abel's concept. Mann's technique involved extruding cellulose membrane material into tiny hollow fibers. In 1967, Richard Stewart, then at the Medical College of Wisconsin, incorporated the fiber tubes into a dialyzer with low priming volume and minimal resistance to flow. The first totally integrated batch delivery system became available in 1968. It was particularly well suited for dialysis center and home patient use. Dialysis was now cheaper, easier, and safer. Although only 3,000 patients were being treated in the United States in 1967, improvements in equipment paved the way for a steady rise in patient population. In less than 3 years, the number in the U.S. increased to 5,000, but the cost of treatment remained a formidable obstacle.
Around the country, there were many groups, committees, trying to raise funds on an individual basis to buy one kidney machine at a time. It was felt that this was probably the wrong way. So therefore, in the mid-60s, a number of us met and decided to go to Washington. That journey took almost 7 years, through 1965 to 1972. During that time, there were many ups and downs concerning how we were going to get the legislation. The legislation was passed in November of 1972, and it is famous because it is known as H.R. 1 92603, famous to every individual in the United States who takes care of patients with kidney disease and every patient who must receive care from nephrologists throughout this country. What has it done? It actually allowed, for the first time in America, for everyone, no matter where they came from,
no matter what age, what part of the country, what the socioeconomic condition, the ethnic or racial group, to receive health care equally. However, it just didn't do this for Americans. It served as a model for the world, because soon after that, many countries decided to follow the American experience and ensure this kind of care for their people.
Government funding helped, and the large-scale involvement of the universities, associations, and corporations in dialysis research and development changed the character of treatment. Now the goal was to improve efficiency, safety, and comfort. Because of time and labor considerations, disposable dialyzers began to replace reusable equipment. Devices were created to automatically control and monitor as many operations as possible, such as heparin input, temperature and composition of the solution, air and blood leaks, fluid pressure, arterial and venous pressure. Technology reached out to develop new membrane materials, miniaturize equipment, prevent complications, and improve the general health of the patient. With many of the technical problems of dialysis resolved, science and industry began to focus on the quality of life, issues of physical, psychological, and economical well-being. In the late 1970s, continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, CAPD, was introduced. CAPD takes place on a continuous basis, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. This self-administered form of dialysis gives the patient greater independence, freeing him from a machine and a location, allowing him to travel, go to school, and to work. CAPD is a form of blood cleansing in which sterile dialysis solution is introduced into the abdominal or peritoneal cavity through a permanently implanted catheter. The peritoneum, a membrane surrounding the peritoneal cavity, operates as the dialyzing membrane, filtering and cleansing the blood much like the kidneys do. Wastes pass across it into the solution within the cavity. The solution is then emptied from the body, disposing of the wastes and excess fluids. In the early 1960s, Fred Boone and Henry Tenkoff had shown that chronic peritoneal dialysis was a feasible technique for outpatient use. CAPD, which actualizes their concept, was developed in 1975 by Jack Moncrief at the Austin Diagnostic Clinic and Robert Popovich, a PhD biomedical engineer at the University of Texas. Carl Nolf of the University of Missouri and Demetrius Oreopoulos of the Toronto Western Hospital also were involved in its development. CAPD has great potential for rural, isolated, and third-world people with kidney failure. Dialysis has indeed come a long way from Abel's vivid diffusion device, but scientists are not yet satisfied. They are working to overcome the complications of anemia common to patients with renal failure, to control fluctuations in chemical and fluid balance that affect the patient's sense of well-being, to decrease the duration of the procedure while maintaining its efficiency, and to prevent the cardiovascular complications prevalent in dialysis patients. They foresee refinements in access for both hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis, and ultimately an effective, practical, wearable artificial kidney. The question asked by the kidney patient has shifted now from how long will I live to how well. The challenge of dialysis continues.